Have you ever felt an eerie unease around someone, like a sudden drop in temperature you can't explain, as if something unsettling was hiding behind their pleasant demeanor? Carl Jung, one of the most influential thinkers in modern psychology, identified a deeply troubling pattern during his clinical work. He observed that the most dangerous threats in human interactions don't always come from open hostility or visible aggression, but from something far more insidious, something our instincts sense long before our minds do. These subtle warnings don't emerge in loud voices or obvious mistreatment, but in small dissonant cues we often dismiss. Jung managed to define what ancient wisdom had long hinted at. The gravest dangers often come clothed in charm, charisma, and apparent normality. And when this hidden signal appears, there is only one intelligent response: create distance immediately. This is shadow projection at work, the unconscious act of attributing one's denied flaws and undesirable traits to others. The shadow is made up of everything we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, traits we deem unacceptable and buried deep in the unconscious. These elements don't simply vanish, instead they build up energy beneath the surface. When a person consistently projects their shadow, it signals a complete blindness to these disowned aspects. From their perspective, they're not projecting. They genuinely believe you are embodying those very flaws they refuse to accept in themselves. This pattern of projection is not a modern discovery. Spiritual and philosophical traditions across cultures have long described this phenomenon in different terms. In Buddhism, it's called the darkened mirror, the idea that we perceive our own inner impurities as if they belong to others. In Christianity, it's the parable of the beam in one's own eye while judging the speck in another's. What makes this pattern so alarming is that the projector truly believes in the reality of their perception. They're not lying, they are convinced. This certainty is powerful and persuasive. It can even sway others to see you through their distorted lens. Neuroscience now supports Jung's insights, revealing that our brains filter reality to conform to our beliefs. But when the shadow is massively projected, this filter becomes a warped lens through which reality is no longer recognizable. At that moment, you're not in a conversation. You've become a stand-in for their inner conflict. You're unknowingly caught in a war they're waging against themselves. The danger deepens when this psychological mechanism is fused with what Jung called ego inflation. Ego inflation is a far more subtle and dangerous phenomenon than ordinary arrogance. It's not just someone thinking they're better than others. It's someone who truly believes they are a vessel of righteousness, divinity, or absolute truth. In this state, the person no longer sees themselves as a fallible human but as a messenger of some higher force. This is what Jung referred to as psychic inflation, and he considered it a major psychological threat. Unlike arrogance, which can be detected and dismissed, inflation cloaks itself in moral or spiritual authority. The mystic Meister Eckhart warned about this centuries ago, calling it the most deceptive trap on the spiritual path. In Zen, it's known as Zen sickness, and in Sufi tradition, the veil of light, a delusion more dangerous than darkness, precisely because it masquerades as enlightenment. One unmistakable sign of this inflation is the inability to entertain doubt. While the greatest sages in history embraced humility, those under the spell of psychic inflation are completely certain of their correctness. They don't see their beliefs as opinions, but as universal truths. This certainty is magnetic. It draws people in, offering the comforting illusion of clarity in an uncertain world. Jung saw how inflated egos could generate charismatic leaders who convinced others with sheer conviction, not reason. Chilean psychologist Claudio Naranjo remarked that the spiritual ego is the hardest to detect. An ordinary ego says, "I'm important." The spiritual ego says, "I am the channel of the ultimate good." This distinction is subtle but crucial. It explains why spiritually inflated individuals often attract devoted followers, even as they drift into dangerous psychological territory. Identify psychic inflation in someone. Observe how they react to disagreement. A person under ego inflation doesn't treat criticism as helpful input, but as an assault on their sacred mission. Any challenge is perceived not as a personal dispute, but as resistance to divine will or higher truth. Jung warned that this condition is dangerous not only to those around the individual, but to the individual themselves. The tension of identifying one's limited ego with vast, transpersonal forces becomes unbearable. Eventually, the psyche demands compensation, and the greater the inflation, the more dramatic the eventual breakdown when the denied shadow erupts. Equally concerning is the phenomenon of total identification with the social persona, a mask so carefully constructed that all traces of the true self are hidden. Jung borrowed the term persona from Greek theater, where actors wore masks to play roles. In psychological terms, the persona is our public face, the identity we present to the world. But when someone fully identifies with this mask, when the line between performance and authenticity disappears, it signals a deep inner disconnect. The person becomes what society expects, abandoning their inner reality for a polished facade. Our instincts often notice this before our intellect does. Everything might seem right on the surface, perfect smiles, correct words, but something feels off. It's not the mask itself that's dangerous, but forgetting that it's a mask at all. This disconnect creates a peculiar unease. Neuroscience has found that our brains contain mirror neurons that detect inconsistencies between someone's words, expressions, and underlying emotional reality. When all we receive is a polished surface devoid of depth, these neurons send us warning signals, a gut feeling that something is wrong. Behind this artificial perfection lies a dangerous imbalance. As the person invests more psychic energy into maintaining their public image, their rejected traits gather in the unconscious. And the stricter the mask, the more violent the eruption when the shadow breaks through. Jung's collaborator Marie-Louise von Franz observed that people who appear flawlessly adapted are often those who experience the most intense and destructive outbursts when the repressed material can no longer be contained. Finally, there is one of the most disturbing phenomena Jung ever identified: archetypal possession. Imagine speaking with someone when suddenly, something in their presence shifts dramatically. Their body is the same, but the energy, the gaze, the tone, everything feels altered, as if a deeper force is speaking through them. Many ancient cultures understood this and described it as a form of spiritual or demonic possession. Jung framed it psychologically. An archetype from the collective unconscious has overwhelmed the individual's ego. Archetypes are primal patterns that shape human behavior, and when they take over, the person loses themselves, becoming a vessel for forces too vast for the personal psyche to integrate. And this state, individuality, disappears, and what remains is a human being acting under the influence of something ancient and impersonal. Shamanic traditions recognized this, often creating rituals to help individuals navigate or exorcise such overpowering energies. In the modern world, however, these episodes often go unrecognized. We explain them away or rationalize them, even as we feel the undeniable strangeness of what we've just witnessed. But when someone loses their center and becomes possessed by an archetype, whether it's the martyr, the hero, the savior, or the persecutor, we are no longer dealing with a person but with a psychological force playing itself out through a fragile human vessel. Mircea Eliade documented in detail how ancient shamans carefully distinguished between controlled states of spiritual channeling and dangerous states of psychic possession, where the ego, the personal sense of self, was entirely overwhelmed. In Christian mysticism, this discernment was known as the testing of spirits, the essential capacity to distinguish between helpful influences and those that were spiritually or psychologically destructive. A clear danger signal arises when someone becomes rigidly locked into a single archetypal identity. Whether they see themselves as the savior, the martyr, the judge, or the eternal victim, the archetype itself is not the problem. It's the complete identification with it that reveals a deep fracture in the psyche. You can often sense it in their presence, a strange intensity in the eyes, a stiffness in their speech, and an uncanny feeling that the person is no longer entirely there. As Jungian analyst Robert Moore once explained, you're no longer engaging with a full human being, but with an archetypal fragment that has hijacked their consciousness. Modern neuroscience has begun to confirm this ancient psychological insight. In certain altered states, brain regions associated with personal identity quiet down, while areas linked to transpersonal or archetypal experience become highly active. In ritual or therapeutic settings, this can be transformative. But when these states emerge spontaneously, without any grounding or conscious containment, they can become deeply destabilizing. The most alarming feature of archetypal possession is the intoxicating clarity it gives. All the ambiguity and self-doubt that typically characterize healthy consciousness vanish, replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose and certainty. This conviction, though rooted in illusion, is extremely persuasive. Jung observed that many political and religious leaders throughout history were gripped by archetypal possession, using their inflated certainty to mobilize mass movements. Yet what made them dangerous was not their charisma. It was their total identification with an archetype, whose dark polarity they couldn't see. Every archetype contains both light and shadow. The savior archetype carries both compassion and fanaticism. When a person becomes the archetype, the shadow inevitably follows, usually without their awareness. Jung documented cases where individuals under archetypal possession committed acts completely opposed to their stated values, only to rationalize them afterward, or experience partial amnesia. In such moments, the person has lost the core human capacity for self-reflection, the inner mirror that keeps us tethered to reality. But there is an even more haunting psychological mechanism that often accompanies possession, what Jung called the compulsion to repeat. This is not simply bad luck or poor judgment. It's a powerful, unconscious drive to recreate the same painful scenarios over and over again, often with different people but eerily similar dynamics. The person appears to be trapped in an invisible loop, reliving the same betrayal, abandonment, or conflict like a script they can't stop performing. And what makes it tragic is that they don't realize they are the unconscious author of that script. Contemporary neuroscience has discovered that early, especially traumatic experiences forge deep neural pathways in the brain. These become grooves of expectation, automatic templates through which the person unconsciously interprets and recreates their world. The brain seeks to confirm what it already believes, even when those beliefs are painful. Christopher Bollas described these deep-rooted imprints as unthought knowns, psychic facts so early or overwhelming that they were never verbalized, yet go on to shape all later experience. Spiritual traditions have long pointed to this principle. The Buddhist concept of karma originally referred not to moral judgment, but to the cyclical patterns of behavior that unconsciously replicate suffering. Likewise, the Judeo-Christian idea of original sin can be understood psychologically as the transmission of unconscious pain and conflict from generation to generation. You can often recognize this pattern in someone who seems to repeatedly fall into the same types of dysfunctional relationships or crises. They play out the same emotional story with new actors, but the plot never really changes. Even more disturbingly, they often appear genuinely surprised each time the scenario repeats, as though fate has cursed them, rather than acknowledging their unconscious participation. And what's even more dangerous is that people caught in these compulsions tend to draw others into their inner drama. They unconsciously recruit partners, friends, or colleagues to play out unresolved internal roles. As psychoanalyst Donald Kalschit noted, unintegrated trauma always demands expression, and it will find a stage, with or without our consent. Jung himself noticed how the more unconscious the repetition, the more it seemed to manifest as uncanny coincidences or synchronicities. The individual's unconscious, he believed, orchestrates life events to mirror its own unresolved dynamics, leading the person to experience these patterns not as internal problems, but as external destiny. This phenomenon is particularly evident when someone consistently tells stories of betrayal, rejection, or injustice, stories that follow a hauntingly similar arc, regardless of the circumstances. Jung's colleague, Marie-Louise von Franz, captured it simply: until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The magnetic pull of these patterns is profound. People trapped in repetition compulsions emit subtle psychological signals that attract others capable of playing complementary roles in their unresolved dramas. Jung called this negative synchronicity, a sort of reverse alchemy in which the unconscious guides external life not toward healing, but toward reenactment. Yet Jung also believed there was a way out, a path that, while difficult, leads toward real transformation. the conscious integration of the shadow. This, he believed, was the dividing line between those who become dangerous and those who become whole. Shadow integration does not mean becoming morally perfect or eradicating negative traits. On the contrary, it means seeing clearly and humbly the parts of ourselves we would rather deny: our envy, aggression, cowardice, pride, and taking responsibility for them. Jung once said, "I'd rather be whole than good," a phrase often misunderstood. He meant that true psychological integrity lies not in appearing virtuous, but in becoming internally unified. So now the question turns to you. Have you recognized any of these signs in others, or more courageously, in yourself? True transformation begins not with blame, but with awareness. Share in the comments what this stirred in you, and if you feel this message could awaken someone else to the unconscious patterns shaping their life, pass it on. Consciousness is the first step toward change, and perhaps the most powerful act of healing we can offer this world.